Welcome, everybody, to the December 8th, 2020 Citizens Climate Lobby Canada call. I am pretty excited tonight to have Michael Bernstein from Canadians for Clean Prosperity here on the call because the data from his organization is pretty compelling and very much, not in, well, as a scientist, I don't like to say very much, but in good alignment with what we're lobbying for. So just a little bit about Michael. He joined Clean Prosperity in 2018. He comes from the business world. He was the CEO of Mother Earth Organics, a small business that delivered organic produce from local farms to families all around the GTA or the Greater Toronto Area. Sorry for people outside of Ontario. And prior to that, he worked in at McKinsey. So he's got a vast background in business and working with people hands-on, and just really grateful to have him here tonight. Michael, I turn this over to you. But before I say that, these are the best carbon pricing enthusiasts on the planet.
Yeah.
For you. So have fun.
Yes, wonderful. Well, thanks so much, Kathy, and thanks to all of you. It's great to be with you all and appreciate your interest and appreciate all the work you're doing too. We are kindred spirits, I think, in terms of the work that we're all doing and why we're doing it and how we think we should be going about it. So what I'll do tonight is I think I'll just give some brief remarks around the recent report that we put out, and then would be very happy to have a discussion. The report that we did, and actually I'll pull up a PowerPoint as I do that, but the report was really intended to look at how can we meet the 2030 and 2050 climate goals that the federal government has set out, and in particular trying to clarify what role carbon pricing will play and what role complementary policies to carbon pricing can play. I think there's been for too long a debate between should it be carbon pricing or should it be other policies, and the reality is we need everything. Pricing should really be at the heart of how we solve this problem, because we know it's for all the reasons probably all of you on the call know about, it being low cost and being flexible, etc. But it's not the whole answer, and so we wanted to really demonstrate that and demonstrate where pricing fits in. So let me just, as I said, I would pull up my presentation here. Hopefully, folks, can everybody see my screen? I'll look for some nods. Looks like a thumbs up there. Okay, great, thank you. Okay, so I won't be able to get through all of this, but I'll just point out a few things and then we can jump into a discussion. So basically what we found is in order to try to meet Canada's 2030 and 2050 objectives, we really want to be focused on three policy areas. The first is carbon pricing, no surprise, and I'll spend most of my time on that. But we did say that we think the second pillar should be around a carbon capture and storage, really actually a carbon removal agenda to try to pull some of the carbon that we've put into the atmosphere out and back into the ground. And then a third piece is looking at complementary policies. So what are the gaps left by carbon pricing, and how can we target specific policies to specific sectors where we know we need to make more progress? And a good example is the building sector. We know we're going to need to retrofit existing buildings, and that pricing, for a variety of reasons, probably won't alone be a powerful enough signal. So those are really the three high-level pillars. We really think there's an opportunity for Canada not only to reduce its emissions, which is obviously critical, but also to increase its competitiveness and to help create economic growth through this strategy. And of note, we also think that actually a lot of the benefits could go to the prairies. I mean, they'll be felt across the country, but in particular, there is some real reason to think that a large share of the benefits could accrue to those regions where we know, they're facing some tough situations in terms of the oil and gas sector today and the future that it faces. So having said all that, so that's just a graphic that basically says the same thing. So let's talk about carbon pricing. And so we feel like for carbon pricing to play, well, first of all, let me just say that this table, which I'll talk you through because it's a little bit dense, looks at what role could carbon pricing play for 2030 and 2050. And the punchline is that if we keep the existing system, the one today that splits out the consumer price and the industrial output-based pricing system, which I assume most on the call here are familiar with, we can get about 92% of the way to closing the Paris gap. And if we but if we strengthen that policy in either scenario 2 or scenario 3 that I'm showing in this table, we could actually get even more emissions reductions. So if scenario 1 was keep the current policy, stay the course, increase $10 a year, scenario 2 would be keep increasing $10 a year, but instead of the output-based pricing model, let's move to full pricing for industry combined with a border carbon adjustment that would protect competitiveness. And if we did that, we would see significantly higher emissions reductions. So you see, instead of 71 megatons of reductions, as it says in the first column here, it would go to 114 megatons. And if we really wanted to be even more ambitious, scenario 3 says, what if we actually increase carbon pricing by $15 a year rather than $10 a year through 2030, and then reverted back to $10 a year after that. And if we did that, we get about 159 megatons of reductions. And if you look out to 2040 is what I'm showing here. So if you look at the look to the column on the right, you can see 250 to 319 megatons of reductions in 2040. The reason why we only go to 2040 is because we feel, and we show this in the report, that once you hit a certain threshold for the carbon price, what you're going to do is you're going to unlock really critical technologies that are going to enable emissions reductions. And so we don't actually believe that we need to, I see somebody trying to enter the room. Should I admit them, by the way, Kathy? I assume I should. But maybe I was made the host probably as part of the presentation feature. But in any case, the point is that we don't feel we need to continue to increase the price beyond 2040, because we think at that point we will have given the private sector all of the signals that we need to help decarbonize the economy. The clearest example of that is through direct air capture, but there's many others. So if you're at a point where the carbon price is significantly higher than the cost of doing direct air capture and removing carbon from the air, you likely don't need to continue to increase that price because you've put in place the right price signals. So that's if there was one takeaway, I think, from the report, it would be that continuing to increase carbon pricing is going to get us most, if not all the way to Paris, and is going to do about half the work to get us to net zero in 2050. But of course, the other things that I'm going to point out here, and I'm going to skip over these scenarios that provide a little more detail. We can come back to those if people are interested in terms of sort of how we calculate things. But in addition to increasing the carbon price to drive decarbonization, the other things that I want to spend a couple minutes pointing out are around improving the carbon pricing design, because we really feel like in order to make this policy durable and publicly supportable over the long term, especially as pricing continues to increase, we need to look at how to make sure we bring Canadians along. And one of the things that I know CCL has been doing some great work on too is looking at, can we make the rebates convert them to be direct payments to Canadians so that people know about the rebate, they know this is an affordable policy. We see very clearly from our polling that too few people know about it today. It's about a third of people, depending on how you ask the question, that actually know they're getting this credit, which is remarkable that it's only a third. And yet if you tell people that they're getting it, support for the carbon pricing policy goes up 20 to 30 percentage points, goes from 20%, rather a 50% support to like 70 or 80. So really important, we think, to get that direct payment. And we think we're on the right track. We actually think the federal government, through your efforts, through some of our efforts, through other efforts, is hearing that message, and I expect that they actually are going to make that change at some point in the next year. Can't happen soon enough in my view, but hopefully it will happen within the next year or so. I'm going to point out a couple of other, let me not skip ahead there. So that's kind of recommendation 1D. I'll just walk through the other 3 recommendations that you see on these bullets, and then I'll probably pause and we can have a discussion and take questions. But some of the other policy design choices that we would really like to see made by the government are, we would like to see the GST on the carbon tax be folded into the program and be included as part of the rebates. And in particular, I think if we've done some analysis that suggests that rural residents in particular face much higher costs than urban residents on average. And the 10% top up that many of you may know is going to rural residents today, we think is not quite sufficient. We would like to see that rebate, that top up rather, go to 20% to help compensate for some of the extra costs that those folks face. And we have a similar recommendation related to suburban households that have about a 10% increase in their cost. So that recommendation would be, let's use that GST money on the carbon tax, and let's increase the rebate top ups to help build more enduring support in some of those communities. 1F that you see on this slide is talking about small and medium enterprises. We really feel, and actually, as Kathy said, I was a small business owner before this, so this is a bit of a one that's a little bit near and dear to my heart. I really don't think that enough small businesses are benefiting from this policy today. As many of you will know, 7% of the proceeds from carbon pricing go to small businesses, but today those are done through energy efficiency programs that are not necessarily easy to access for a small business that doesn't have extra staff to apply for a government grant. And for a number of reasons I won't go into today, I think there's a lot of compelling reasons to suggest let's actually just give direct relief to small businesses. So we're recommending a tax credit, and our numbers suggest that you get to a 1% tax credit. I'm calling it a credit rather than a tax cut to small businesses, because as you know, the program is only in select provinces. It's only in 4 provinces. So very hard to do an actual cut to the small business tax rate that's only in some provinces and not in others. So instead we say, let's do a credit that would mimic the tax cut. And let's do that for our small, medium enterprises. And the last recommendation, 1G that you see here, is really related to agricultural, to farms. And to say that, look, the farmers, there are some farmers in some situations that are facing very, very high costs due to the carbon tax. And we want to be sensitive to that. It's certainly the case that we all need to reduce our emissions over time, but we would like to see farmers be given either perhaps an exemption that goes beyond the dyed diesel that they receive today, or probably better, even better still, would be some other programs that the government could devote to giving farmers low carbon alternatives, whether that be anaerobic digesters or other ways to use less fossil fuels, essentially for things like grain drying. So I think that's basically everything I was going to cover. What I didn't cover much, and maybe I'll just flash up on the screen quickly, is we looked at a few different technologies like carbon capture and storage would be an example here, and tried to show that once you get, as I was saying earlier, to a certain carbon price, what you're going to do is you're going to allow the market to take off for some of these technologies, and you're going to see hopefully rapid decarbonization through that. So why don't I pause there? I see we're right at 7:15. And would love to take questions and comments.
Okay, would you like to stop sharing your
Oh,
screen?
yes, let me do that. Thank you.
Okay, there are some questions in the chat. I think we'll start in the order that they came. I'll put them. No, they weren't actually in the chat. They were put in the we have a doodler that we put. Oh, Tom, are you on the line here? Do you want to start with yours, and then we'll go to Guy, and then over to Eric, if that's okay. And then we'll go to Marlo. Okay, that's good. So Tom, are you there? Tom on the line?
Yes,
Yeah,
I
go
am.
ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks very much, Michael. I noticed the report, and I did read, or I skimmed it at least, earlier today. Didn't really reference the target. So I'm concerned that as much as the mechanisms you're talking about, carbon pricing, etc., will help to get to the target, the general point is that the targets are not sufficient, and the science, IPCC and so on, talks about more like a 50% reduction of emissions by 2030. Do any of the scenarios sort of reference that? The other thing I'll just sneak in is that the EU border carbon adjustment comes into place in 2023. Will any of the scenarios you analyze meet their criteria to be exempt, or what impact that might have? So sorry, that's a double barrel question for it.
Great questions. Yeah, so on the first point, the way we looked at this, and we had an appendix about this, but For us, it's really about, if we want to be consistent with the global climate science, we need to be thinking about the cumulative amount of emissions we're putting out from now until we hit net zero in 2050. And there's various ways you could calculate what Canada's fair share is, but we have a methodology that I can get into if folks want. But essentially what we did was we looked at, okay, this is the total, this is the cumulative emissions we think Canada can emit. It's something like, if my memory serves, like 11.5 gigatons, something like that. And then we tried to model out a pathway from now till 2050 that, under some assumptions around how you'd use negative emissions as well, that you could stay consistent with that cumulative carbon budget. And the assumption kind of implicit was we're going to start slower. So we're going to start at a point where we exceed Paris by a little bit, not a ton. And then we're going to have to quickly pick up the pace after that to really stay within that cumulative budget. So the scenarios that we're showing are consistent with that cumulative emissions look, but it's not consistent with the 50% 2030, which I would argue, and we could maybe talk about if folks are interested, is kind of a really helpful way to sort of simplify the problem for policymakers and for communications purposes. But ultimately what matters is not what we do in 2030 or 2050, it's how much total carbon we put in the atmosphere. So we try to stay consistent with that. On your point about BCAs, or border carbon adjustments in the EU, it's not yet clear what the EU is going to do. I think it's a really important topic and one that we're going to be exploring further in some additional research, hopefully that we'll have in the first quarter of next year, so maybe about 3 months, because we definitely want Canada to consider using a border carbon adjustment. And I believe there's actually quite a bit of momentum on that front too, across all parties. So one of the scenarios we did, the second one, which talks about full industrial pricing, the assumption is we'd go to a border carbon adjustment as part of that. And we would do that in coordination with not only the EU, but perhaps even more importantly, the US. But it's sort of high level right now. I wouldn't say that the details are worked out either in our paper or frankly at the European level right now.
Thanks very much.
Great answers. Okay, the next question is Guy. You can ask it or I can ask it. It's in the chat box. You're on mute.
I don't exactly remember what I wrote, but it was something like, how can all the other studies say we need to have higher carbon tax rates than what you're proposing here? Where have they gone wrong, or where have I gone wrong?
Yeah, so I'm not sure which studies you're referring to, but so there's the eco-fiscal. I think the one that suggested the highest number was eco-fiscal. And there, it was the same modeling firm we worked with, actually, Navies Research. But some of the assumptions were different around, both the economy was a little bit different at that point, but also I believe the main reason is that they had fewer complementary policies worked in already. So thinking about the simplest way to answer, as you may know, like there's kind of the government suggests there's a 77 megaton gap to Paris, right? That's what they say. But when you dive into the details, it's really the 77 megatons is kind of made up of some policies that they've already legislated that are in place, like carbon pricing, and some policies that they've said they'll do, but nothing's actually happened on, like the clean fuel standard would actually be an example of that. So a bit of the difference is around how much you assume those announced policies are actually going to happen. We lay this out a little more in detail in the report to show that the gap would actually be bigger if you didn't assume those announced policies happen. So I think that's one factor. I think another factor is just where the modeling was at a year and a half ago when they did it versus where it is today. And probably other things that sometimes when you do modeling, you can't fully reconcile everything. But I will say that the most recent other similar report that's come out was from the PBO, the Parliamentary Budget Office, that is, and it was done in the fall at some point. And the numbers there are actually very similar to ours, within $5 or $10, depending on what scenario you look at.
Well, the study that I looked up was something from University of Massachusetts, and it didn't come to direct conclusions like you did, but the ranges ranged a lot higher than what you're talking about. Anyway, I'm ready to be convinced. So,
Yeah. Well, look, the only other thing I'll say, because I know there's a lot of other questions, is like with modeling, there's always going to be, obviously, your assumptions are critical. And I don't think anyone should sit here and say, look, we have the perfect model or the perfect answer. I think for me, the most important thing is we know carbon pricing can do a lot of the heavy lifting. Now, whether the price needs to be 130 or 160 or 180, I would suggest to you the most important thing is we have to keep the momentum. We have to keep seeing year-over-year increases to send the signal to the private sector. And I don't think a point in time number is that critical either. What I think is that by continuing to increase the price, the most impactful thing we're going to do is we're going to send that signal to the private sector that they can make those investments in whatever it is they need to make it in. It could be energy efficiency, it could be hydrogen, it could be biofuels or carbon capture, but that's what we need to do. That's the biggest power of carbon pricing. So in some ways, I don't think the difference in the models are that material because the trajectory is the same.
I would like to stick to modeling, and then I'll jump over to Eric's question. So we're still in the modeling context. I have a personal question I'd like to ask now that we're talking about modeling.
Right.
Does policy-induced innovation, is that part of the calculations in your modeling from Navies? So the fact that we're going to have this predictable price, and then that's going to induce innovations, is that in there?
To some degree, it is, to some degree, but not perfectly. Like basically it's like, it's the innovation that you can see right now. So like carbon capture and storage, I keep coming back to that because it's an easy one. Like there are estimates today of what the cost, and I was showing them on the screen, right? What the cost is to do carbon capture in a cement plant or a fertilizer plant. But what I think you're going to see is you're going to get innovation in the capture technology itself that's going to bring down costs. You know, hydrogen is another good example. We have an incredible Canadian company right now called Proton Technologies that's trying to get seems to have figured out a way to extract hydrogen directly from underneath the ground without pulling out the rest of the hydrocarbons, which could be a game changer in the cost. So I think the things that we know our technologies are in the model, but I don't think it nearly captures. I mean, when you're going 30 years out, you're going to get new innovations. You're going to get breaks in kind of the cost trajectories of things that is unfortunately very hard to capture in a model. And I have a bunch of other thoughts about that. Maybe we could talk about offline, but that's the short version of that answer.
Well, thanks for answering my favorite thing about all this policy-induced innovation. Sure. So thank you. There's another modeling question, and then we'll jump over to other questions. Has COVID affected your modeling?
Has COVID affected our modeling?
Yeah.
No, it hasn't. That's a good question. So it has not, and we debated this a little bit. But the reality is, you know, because it was a long-term model, we didn't think, the assumption was that the downturn will be about a year or so, right? A year or two. And it wouldn't really change the high level answer. So we didn't spend a lot of time because it kind of hit just as we had set up the model to start doing it. So yeah, the short answer is no, it didn't.
Okay, so this question is really techy, and it's in the chat. It's one of the big ones there. I believe it's from Eric Stark. So Eric, if you can read it from the chat, that's fine, or I can. But it has a lot to do with CCS, and yeah, there's a whole.
Yeah. Is it in the chat? I have to. Well, you read it to know.
Okay, so rather than focusing on geoengineering high-tech carbon removal solutions where the technology is still questionable, would it not be better to simply have a steeper increases in the carbon price with corresponding rebates, thereby letting the market decide the best path to net zero?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yes. Well, so that's a good question, and you know, I and I guess Clean Prosperity are not of the belief that those technologies are experimental. They're, I believe, actually proven today, and we are today every year, or last year anyway, capturing 40 million tons of carbon through carbon capture technology. and it's been in use for decades. It's still new-ish because it hasn't been widely deployed, but it is very proven. There are certainly people who disagree with that, and this is a area where we could spend probably a whole hour discussing it. But our assumption and belief is that it is not, that it is proven, and that it is lower cost than the alternatives. Would it be an alternative to say we just should increase the price further? I suppose, but my assumption, my strong feeling on this is industry will use the price at a certain level to adopt the lowest cost solutions they have at their disposal, and I think those will be some of them. So that'd be my take on that.
Okay, lots of great questions here.
Can I add to that?
Yeah, and then I'll ask Alex can ask a question because it follows up nicely to that. And then John's question follows up nicely to that. And I want a woman to jump in very soon. Okay. So
Well, the only thing is, like, if you did a lot of proposing for tax breaks and this and that for carbon capture or carbon removal. So why should we go that path rather than the pricing path? Why should we burden the taxpayer when the emitters are the ones who are causing the problem, and they're the ones who should be paying?
Yeah, it's a good question. And, I guess for me, I'm most interested in, well, there's two parts to that. The first is that our belief is that over the medium and then long term, pricing should be the mechanism that gets wide-scale market adoption of technologies. But in the short term, not only for carbon capture, but it's true for hydrogen, and it's going to be true for other technologies too. You're going to need investment, at least we believe. You're going to need public policy to help get it over that initial hump so that it is more established, the costs start to come down, and that you can get it deployed en masse. And I think you've seen that with basically every other clean technology, whether it be solar, and this isn't clean technology, but even if you look at how the oil sands started, or the in situ technology that's used today, it had government support. So that would be one answer, one reason. The other reason I would suggest to you is because other countries are doing this. Like the US is doing this today, or a lot of it. And if we want to generate some of the economic benefits that come with our companies being some of the technology leaders in this field, we need to at least keep pace. So that would be a second reason. I think there was a third thing too, but I've lost it now. So I guess I'll just stop. That was on the why have the incentives. Was there another part to your question, Eric?
Yeah, well, I don't want to delay things anymore, but I just don't feel that. I think it's the emitters that really should be paying for all this rather than the general taxpayer, right? Because it's the emitters who are causing the problem, and why aren't they the ones that should pay for it?
Right. Yeah, and I think they will pay for most of it. And look, it's a fair perspective. I guess I would tell you that we all do emit, right? We all are emitters. They might emit a lot more than we do. But I guess for me, it's about, we've got to solve this problem. And if that takes some public funds, I think so be it. But it's more of a philosophical discussion, I think.
Okay, thanks.
yeah, thank you for that. More on carbon capture technology. What is in the pipeline, so to speak, right now, Michael? If you, what are some examples? Maybe not everybody's on the same trajectory of knowledge for carbon capture and sequestration. For those of us who were with us 5 years ago, we had an amazing education on carbon capture and sequestration, and how the IPCC pretty much says we can't get to 1.5C without carbon capture and sequestration. And that Canada has invested a ton of money into that in the early 2010s. So can you dive a little bit deeper into what sort of carbon capture and technology exists today that will benefit from what you're saying?
Sure. Well, then I'll take that in a certain direction. You can tell me if you're hoping for a different direction. But I mean, I think today in Canada, we are capturing about 4 million tons a year of carbon through a number of really big facilities. The two most known examples are Boundary Dam, which is a coal power plant in Saskatchewan, and the Quest facility run by Shell, which is a upgrading facility that makes hydrogen in Alberta. But the challenge up to now has been these projects are so costly to get off the ground. They require like $1 billion of capital expenditure or more. But there are some innovative technologies and companies in this space. The one that comes to mind most clearly for me is a company called Svante that's out in BC that is figuring out a way to do a more modular has a more modular capture technology that's a much lower cost. So they have begun to deploy that in a couple of industrial facilities. They're doing a project with Lafarge, and there's another one too that's escaping me right now, but they've got a project in BC, one in Saskatchewan rather. So I think what you're going to see is we're on the cusp of seeing a lot more investment in this space from probably both natural gas powered facilities, but also on the industry like the steel and cement makers of the world. And then, on the direct air capture front, which is kind of an offshoot of carbon capture and storage, there's a lot of really interesting stuff happening there. We've got the company, the world's leading company, arguably, for sure one of the top two, is in Canada, in BC, and is building the largest carbon capture, direct air capture plant in the world, but they're doing it in Texas because we don't have the policies that would enable them to do it in Canada today. But I do think in the next couple of years, and the Global CCS Institute just put out a report last week, or maybe it was even earlier this week, with their annual look on this, that we are going to see a lot more activity on CCS in Canada and around the world.
Okay, that's wonderful. I think I'm going to deviate a little bit away from carbon capture. We've got about 6 minutes left. I'm just wondering, how does the Navies model, which is what you're working with, compare? I'm reading Jane's question and I'm rewording it a bit, compare to the on-road simulator or the Pembina simulators that are out there? Like, any sort of idea how the models compare?
Yeah, well, so I mean, with every model, it is really difficult to get inside of them and truly understand why they're showing different results. But I'm a big fan of the Pembina simulator, but it is a couple of years old, and so it does need, by Pembina's own admission, it needs an update. And so I think some of the results are different but not necessarily all in the same direction. Some policies might show more emissions reductions than we would show, and others less. So fortunately, it's just tough to compare. I'm less familiar with the on-roads one. I have seen it before, but I haven't really played with it a lot. So I think that I'll sort of revert back to the same answer I gave previously, which is like, I think any model, ours and others, are really directionally helpful, but maybe not to be relied on for precise figures necessarily. And I think the trajectory of all of them are pretty similar as far as I know.
Okay, that's great. We have people who live in rural parts of Canada in Citizens Climate Lobby, and they're asking, which is great, I mean, to have people outside of the big cities in our organization. Maybe we can wind down with this. Regenerative agriculture proponents would suggest there's a huge carbon capture from farming. Does any of the modeling take that into consideration?
So it doesn't, not in addition to kind of what we're seeing already. So it kind of projects forward the same trends that we have today, but there isn't we don't place a lot of emphasis on that actually. And we kind of take what is an uncommon stance on this issue, I think, but I believe it's correct. And I'll share with you what our thinking is. I think it's good to have regenerative agriculture. It's good to have nature-based solutions that help deposit carbon back in the ground. And I think we should have those. But I don't think they should be relied on as a primary strategy for decarbonization. My concern, but I think they have a lot of other benefits, including just other environmental biodiversity benefits, et cetera. But I don't think they should be relied on because I worry that those solutions are less permanent and more subject more at risk of being canceled out by kind of natural events. So if it's carbon going back into soil, that carbon can be released fairly easily if those farming practices are not maintained. If it's planting trees, though, that carbon can be released back into the atmosphere. First of all, it takes a long time to grow a mature forest, but then that carbon can be released very easily through pest infestation or wildfires, etc. So I actually, even though it doesn't intuitively probably immediately grab people, like the nature solutions feel like the right things we should be doing. We should be restoring nature, going back to the way we are. And I totally understand all that. But I actually think the more permanent, secure solutions are in the technologies that bury the carbon deep underground where it will not be released. So a bit of a long answer to the fact that we did not emphasize regenerative agriculture. It is not in the model. It doesn't mean we don't believe in it, but it wasn't an emphasis for us.
Okay, there's a lot more questions in there, but we have this thing at Citizens Climate Lobby called integrity, and we like to be on time. It's one of our values. So I said
Great.
10 to 15 minutes for your presentation, 10 to 15 minutes for questions. And we have like 2 minutes left, and I just and then we're really over. So I think winding down, unless there's a question in the chat box that interests you to answer, if you wanted to look over, and then down, or we can just say goodbye now. I leave that up to you.
Well, I'm just taking a quick scan through this. So I see natural sequestration. I see a lot of questions about restorative agriculture now, actually, interestingly. Yeah, I think, it's hard. It's going to be hard for me to absorb them quickly enough, I think, to give a really good answer. So maybe what I'll do instead is just say that it's truly a delight to talk to all of you. I really, think you're all the heroes of this movement, right? Like the only way that the government, and you guys know this because you talk to them, but like the only reason or a critical factor in the government moving on this policy is to hear from citizens like yourselves, and to be volunteering your time like this is really incredible and heartwarming. And I just really appreciate everything you're doing. So if you have further questions, we can certainly talk offline at another point. And I just look forward to collaborating with all of you in the near future. And I think we're going to get a lot of what we want. I actually am fairly optimistic that we're going to see increased carbon pricing, and we're going to build greater consensus around climate policy, good, smart climate policy in Canada. So thanks for everything you're doing, and thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here tonight. And we have a long relationship going back with Canadians for Clean Prosperity. Yes. And I know we're going to have it going forward too. Your work totally complements ours, and we're partners on this. Not partners, but you know what I mean. We're
sure.
Pals. We're carbon pricing pals. How's that? Okay, so thank you so much.
That's great.
Everyone for being here tonight. That was excellent.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, everybody. Really good to be with you. Okay, take care. Bye now.
Bye. Thanks. I will stay on if there's any last questions or comments. Sorry we couldn't get to every question, but any last questions or comments?
I think I might send my questions directly to his email address. He offers that on his website.
You should, John. I found your questions to be really technical. So, and I think
they were a bit technical, yeah.
Yeah. So sorry, and you know I love you. So,
I love you too, honey.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, thanks for contact them directly. They'll love your questions.
Right. Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? A little bit more about the on-road simulator. Doug was so kind enough to be one of our ambassadors. They've updated it, so the numbers will change if Jane is still on the line. So that policy simulator is changing. For you nature-based solution fans out there, if you've looked in the action sheets, our February call is going to be with somebody who's trying to wrap her head around carbon pricing and nature-based solutions. There are no answers out there. And she knows you're the smartest volunteers on the planet with regards to carbon pricing. So she's asked to speak to all of you and see if we can kind of maybe hive this for a while, because nobody knows the answers. Just like 20 years ago, nobody knew how to price carbon in the fossil fuel industry. So how can we do this in nature too? We're gonna get that discussion going, even though it won't be what we lobby for. There's obviously a passion amongst many of you for trying to figure out how to take what we've learned from fossil fuels and transfer it into nature-based solutions. So that'll be one of our mind benders of the 2021. So
Okay.
thank you, everyone. That was lovely. Thanks for being here.
Yeah. Thanks, Kathy.
Thank you.
Good night.
Night.
Thanks,
Oh,
Kathy.
I love that Brian put from Mi'kmaq territory. That was awesome. I should have, yeah, that was great. I would have, it's just the educational calls. We don't have time to do land acknowledgements, but I love that you did. Thank you.
No problem. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Good night, everybody. Is that okay?